There's a handful of major catalysts for SoFi to look forward to in 2025 that I've discussed in previous videos. We have the loan platform business, we have the reintroduction of crypto potentially coming in 2025, and the reacceleration of the company back to growth mode. But there's one catalyst that nobody is talking about online with regards to SoFi's technology platform. Now, we know technology has been lackluster in 2024, and I think this catalyst has the potential to completely turn that around. The tech platform Galileo did about $395 million of net revenue for the full year 2024, but there's a $3.7 billion opportunity ahead of it, about 10x of their full year 2024 revenue. And I wanted to dedicate an entire video to talking about this topic because I think it has a big potential for Galileo if we really connect the dots. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Now, this entire video is going to be a breakdown of a Fox interview that was conducted 2 days ago on Friday discussing the IRS budget and what the DOGE committee is finding after their initial audits. And as somebody who's been working in the software industry for the past decade, watching this interview honestly left me kind of speechless, and I absolutely had to break it down in a video of my own. This Fox interview on Friday featured two individuals. The first is Sam Korkos, who is the CEO of Levels. He's also held multiple CEO and CTO positions in the past, working in the software industry his entire career. The second individual is Scott Bessent, who is the Treasury Secretary. Now, before I even go into the content of the interview itself, I wanted to talk about the individuals themselves because understanding who these people are will help us understand what their mental models are for how they see the world in the backdrop of this conversation. Because Sam Korkos is a serial entrepreneur. He's held multiple executive leadership positions in the software industry. And sitting right beside him is Scott Bessent, who has a net worth of upwards of $500 million. These people are incredibly successful in previous endeavors as executives and as leaders of their field. And as is the case, many of the individuals in the DOGE committee, they're just volunteering their time to optimize the public sector in addition to their current existing commitments with their own companies. So immediately off the bat, I have a higher level of confidence in these individuals because they have a resume of tangible, successful results that people can just point to. They've raised companies, they've raised funds, and as a result, they're very wealthy individuals. They're not career politicians. They've not been working for the public sector their entire career. They are outsiders in the cleanest sense of the word. And so I want to highlight that all of these perspectives in this interview comes from individuals who have mental models that have led to previous successes, and they're also outsiders to the existing structures when they're approaching this problem. And I think that perspective is really important because sometimes you need outsiders who are not inundated with the problem, who can ask very simple questions and try to break down things from a first principles perspective in a way that insiders just cannot because they have all of this context around them that sometimes clouds their judgment. Now, as we go through this video, I'll be breaking out parts of this interview. The full clip is 12 minutes long. I'll attach it in the description. But basically in this interview, they talk about how they're behind schedule, how the infrastructure is very, very old. They're using 30 to 50-year-old systems to solve this problem, how they're not processing that much data, and how they're optimistic that this problem can be solved. And what they highlight as the main problem here being the disconnect between the leadership and the people doing the actual work. They talk about how they're approaching this problem, talking to people on the ground, and how those people have never really been empowered in the past.
Yeah, I've been brought in to look at the IRS's modernization program in particular, as well as the operations and maintenance budget. This is a huge program that's currently 30 years behind schedule, and it's already $15 billion over budget. The IRS has some pretty legacy infrastructure. It's actually very similar to what banks have been using. It's old mainframes running COBOL and assembly. The challenge has been, how do we migrate that to a modern system? Virtually every bank has already done this, but we're still using a lot of those same systems. Typically in industry, this takes a few years, maybe a few $100 million, and we're now 35 years into this program. If you ask them now, it's 5 years away, and it's been 5 years away since 1990. It's supposed to be delivered in 1996, and it's still 5 years away.
The first thing you do is just get into the guts of the system and see how it operates?
Yeah, really talk to the software developers. Talk to the people on the ground and what they're seeing. One encouraging thing is we actually have quite a lot of software talent on the ground, the people writing code. We actually have quite a lot of good people. It is almost always the case that when I ask them what the correct answer is, how do we solve these problems, they're almost always right, which is good. They just haven't been in a position to be empowered to make those decisions. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that we can solve this.
One of the biggest surprises for me is just seeing how these entrenched interests, they just keep constricting themselves around the power, around the money, around the systems, and nobody cares. The other thing we're seeing too is, as Sam said, some of the employees, many of the employees are fantastic. It's this consultant group they're like a boa constrictor. They've constricted themselves around our government. The costs are unbelievable that are being passed on to the American tax.
It's hard to really grasp the scale of this because we process at the IRS about the same amount of data as a mid-sized bank. A typical mid-sized bank will have somewhere between 1 and 200 people in IT, and they'll have an operations and maintenance budget in like the $20 million a year range. We have 8,000 people in IT, and our operations and maintenance budget is $3.5 billion a year. I don't really know why yet, but I will tell you that 80% of that budget goes to contractors and licenses.
So the contractors and putting these projects out to bid, Mr. Secretary, how big a problem has that been?
Well, clearly it's a problem, and I wanted to bring Sam in because I just got a briefing from him, and my jaw hit the ground when he was talking about the cost. I have 3 priorities with the IRS: collections, privacy, and customer service, and none of those are being well served. I mean, look at the scale of this.
We cannot perform the basic functions of tax collection without paying a toll to all these contractors. We really have to figure out how to get out of this hole. We're in a really deep hole right now. We have a $3.5 billion operations and maintenance budget. We have a $3.7 billion modernization effort within IT. That's a lot of budget, and we are way beyond any reasonable cost for what you would expect at a private company for this.
When you first saw this, what was the biggest surprise that you found at that Department of Treasury?
I would say it's the disconnect between leadership and the people actually doing the work is a big one. It doesn't take a lot, just somebody who cares to solve these problems. You find contracts that are 10, 20, 30, 50 million dollars, and you just ask, like, why are we doing this? And everyone's just like, I don't know. And then you cancel it, and then nothing happens. It's just inertia has just taken over.
What? I mean, okay. I'm so frustrated in hearing this, but I'm so glad you're getting your hands dirty by getting in there.
I think most people that I've interacted with are really excited that somebody actually cares now. They've been in a situation where their hands are tied and they can't solve the things that they know need to be solved.
Okay, so there was a lot of information in that clip, but first let me tackle the DOGE process of how they're approaching this problem. Again, as an outsider looking in, they're talking to people on the ground, and Sam mentioned that the people on the ground know what they have to do, but they've never been empowered to make those decisions. A lot of the reason is because the consultants balloon the costs, but not only do they do that, but they also change the direction of what should be done. And before we even go into the tech debt, the fact that the architecture is like 50 years old, that's one layer of the problem. You add this extra layer of people debt, essentially process debt. As you add more consultants, you add more busy work, you add more processes, and you add more systems that oftentimes don't really need to be there. And with different consultants talking to each other, it contradicts one another. And because they have no real sense of ownership on the problem. I've consulted with companies personally, so this is from a first-hand accounting of how this works. In my time consulting, generally I have a fixed-term contract of 6 months or of 12 months, and then you can choose to go open-ended from there. And what happens is, as a consultant, you have no real ownership over the product because you always know that the contract is going to come to an end at some point or another. You're strictly a mercenary that's brought on to execute and do a job, and then you have no real accountability for what that outcome is because you always have this temporary mindset of not ever owning the problem fully. And so you have this paradigm of the consultant, and you contrast that with the paradigm of a lifer at a company, a person who is empowered, who's risen through the ranks over the years, who started out at the very, very bottom, and who is now holding a leadership position. That person has a much deeper sense of responsibility in the end result because they've been the ones that have been building up towards that result from the ground up for years. A consultant will never have that same level of responsibility because they're on one project today, and 6 months from now, they're on an entirely new project with an entirely new company, with a new mandate in a new vertical altogether. And so the way to really address these issues, even without looking at the technology debt for a second, is just to look at how we are incentivizing the people and structuring the teams to get the results we want. So you have these two cohorts of people, and for as long as this problem is not addressed, as more time passes, what happens is the people who care the most slowly become disenfranchised. They stop putting up their hand. They stop suggesting positive changes because they know that they're always going to be overwritten. The people with the good ideas don't have the autonomy to execute on those good ideas. And every year that passes that this is the case adds more and more hurdles to the overall problem. And oftentimes I've seen this personally happen, right? I enter an organization and I look at all of their existing processes of how they work. And what I'll notice is different parts of the process have been implemented by different groups of consultants at different years. And the end result is this random patchwork of different tools, different processes, different approval systems that have been implemented by different groups of people. And over time, it sort of becomes a silent killer. It's sort of like quicksand, right? Like if you accidentally step into quicksand and it's just your foot, it's relatively easy to remove it. You just yank it really hard and you get out. But the longer you let it linger, it just sinks deeper and deeper and deeper. And the inertia becomes harder and harder to counteract. And it becomes harder to escape because the system you've built around yourself pulls you down by its very design. And this can happen from a tech debt perspective, but it can also happen from a process and people debt perspective. And this is exactly what's happened in government systems. And this is exactly what's been happening because, as Sam mentioned, the IRS processes about the same amount of data as a mid-sized bank would. By contrast, though, where a mid-sized bank would have about 200 or 300 engineers on staff, the IRS has 8,000 IT people with a $3.5 billion IT budget, 80% of which goes to contractors. This is absolutely mind-boggling because the other problem you have with contractors is you have bidding. And bidding is always a problem with contractors, but the reason it's crippling in government is because government has no real competition. The private sector always has competition that keeps them as a check and balance. And I'll give you another example, right? I often bid on contracts, but they're in the private sector. And what usually happens is they index on quality and outcomes as well as the price. But because the government doesn't really have any competing agencies, like the IRS doesn't have a competitor to keep them accountable, as a result, the incentive structures for government are slightly different than the private sector. Because in the private sector, if I'm offering services in the form of a contract, I'm saying this is the output, these are the results, and this is the quality assurance that you're going to get as a result of you bringing my company on to service this problem. In the government, it's really just a factor of price. And so the incentive structure for private is quality, efficiency, outcomes, and guarantees and price, whereas in government, in public sector, it's basically just price because they have no accountability mechanism built in. And so as a result, they always take the cheapest contract that always will lead to subpar results because you have third parties that are undercutting each other and you're never going to get the highest quality by having the cheapest result. And you would imagine by always going with the cheapest option, you're going to be dissatisfied with the result, but they never are. They're always tolerated in public sector because there is no alternative and there is no competition to take away the business of the IRS. They're essentially a monopoly in that space because they're a government agency. And this is also why you have this massive ballooning budget, over $7 billion of budget, which if you're looking at the banks of the US, $7 billion is like some pretty big mid-sized banks out there as an entire market cap. And yet the IRS has this just as a budget. So what I'm trying to say is the lack of accountability leads to more bloat. And that bloat increases every single year. And extrapolate that by the amount of years this has been going on is a factor of how difficult that problem is going to be to reverse because you're deeper and deeper and deeper into this quicksand. As I was listening to this interview, I was thinking about Galileo because Galileo offers all of this stuff out of the box, which immediately modernizes the technology stack and reduces the cost drastically because they do it with a fraction of the headcount and a fraction of the budget. And in the past, an initiative like this with regards to Galileo would have never been entertained because there was never any accountability. But now that you have DOGE entering, you have a layer of accountability that you didn't have before because DOGE has a massive mandate to fix this problem in the most cost-effective way possible. And more importantly, they would want to have it in a sustainable way that does not balloon the cost the minute that they leave the system. And so my mind immediately went to a third-party solution like Galileo because it has a dual mandate of modernizing while also being sustainable long-term. And it does it in the most cost-effective way possible. I found it interesting how Sam said most of the banks have already gone through this modernization process because even though banks have minimum competition, they are very monopolistic by nature. They are still more competitive in the private sector banking than they are in the public sector government. And so it would stand to reason that banks would be faster moving the government agencies who literally are still using technology that is 30 to 50 years old. Like imagine you going into work and trying to do your job on a brand new 2025 MacBook versus a laptop that is 30 years old? What would be the performance difference that you're having in your output of your job? I would imagine it's going to be pretty freaking drastic. So just think of that as a concept as you have this in your mental model. I also found it interesting, Scott Bessent's three priorities. Like, he is the Treasury Secretary. Ultimately, he's going to be the person who has the final say. He said that his three priorities are collection, privacy, and customer service. And the reason why this is interesting to me is because this is going to be well served in the lens of a third party, because right now you have much of this being done out of the box completely with something like Galileo. And so my entire rationale for making a video like this was to advocate for Galileo being a very simple one-stop shop for all three of these services that Scott Bessent highlighted that meets the needs of government agencies right now. It's plug and play. And in my mind, that is the cleanest possible solution, because if you were to go the other way around, it would require a massive re-architecture, a complete overhaul of the tech stack, but also of all the internal processes that leads to that tech stack. And keep in mind, you have 8,000 people. It's nearly impossible to have a headcount of that size have a scrappy startup-like mentality. It's very difficult for some of the most efficient private companies in the world to do it. We saw over the past couple of years, Meta laying off people, Amazon laying off people, Google laying off people. And the reason they're doing it is to become more efficient, because you have this law of diminishing returns the larger you get. And the results you had there was the moment you cut bloat, you increase efficiency. And that's a little bit counterintuitive if you've never worked in tech, because in your mind, you would have a linear association of headcount to output. If you have 10 more people working on a construction site, you get 10 times the efficiency output. It doesn't work like that for software development. If you have an engineering team that's 10 times larger, it does not result in 10 times more efficiency unlocks. There is diminishing returns to a point where it reaches zero with every new engineer added, which is essentially the bloat problem that many companies have had. And I would argue in the case of the IRS, they've crossed that point of diminishing returns a couple thousand engineers ago. They don't need 8,000 engineers. They don't even need 800 engineers. Hell, maybe they can get by with 80 engineers if they have the right systems and the right processes to serve as scaffolding. But because they've never had structures and they've never had process in the past, they would always default to advocating for more people and ballooning headcount to essentially serve a problem that is a process problem. And you see this firsthand. It's counterintuitive, but you see teams of 10 engineers working way faster than teams of 100 engineers. And you see teams of 100 engineers working way faster than teams of 1,000 engineers. And this is also something that pushes me in the direction of advocating for Galileo, because it would be better served not only from a cost perspective, but also from a speed and efficiency perspective if they were to go out of the box for the solution. And I think the budget is really the craziest point here, because you're thinking of a $3.5 billion budget for operations, but then you also have a $3.7 billion budget for modernization. And it's absolutely staggering to think about, because you have to keep in mind that Galileo did about $400 million of revenue for the full year 2024. And you think $3.7 billion just for modernization? Like, if I was Derek White, Galileo CEO, or David Foyer, Galileo CPO, I would be tapping every single person in my network to give demos around Galileo, dedicating an entire team focused only on the IRS, winning some of these contracts. And the ironic part is that you would have never had Galileo bidding for contracts in the old system, because the old system only optimized for lower prices. But now that you have a layer of accountability in government systems through DOGE that optimizes for service of quality, that optimizes for efficiency as key metrics when looking for a third-party bidder, now is when I, as Sofi and Galileo, would start pounding the table on this as a technology solution out of the box. And listen to Sam when he talks about the disconnect between leadership in those agencies and the actual people doing the work. As a result of their audits, they found multi-million-dollar contracts which nobody can really justify why they've been given out. Money is thrown around with zero accountability, because the perception is that the coffers are unlimited, the money is never going to run out, there is no sense of urgency, there is no competition, there are no checks and balances for the quality of the actual output itself. To the point where even when you cancel these contracts, nothing happens. There's no repercussions, which begs the question of how long have these contracts been given out and what has been the ROI on them for this period of time? It's negative, we all know that, because a lot of these contracts add even more bloat to the problem. They add more to the problem as opposed to working towards the solution. And so this is why I think it's a massive opportunity for Galileo, because you now have these new checks and balances in place where even if as a thought experiment, we source the contracts from Galileo entirely from scrapping old contracts that had zero value, and we don't blow up the IRS budget by a single penny, we can still make multiples in terms of efficiency going from Galileo than they had with all these previous contracts. Now, the question you're thinking about is, what is actually the real probability of SoFi capturing some of that IRS budget? If you were to assign a percentage right now, what number would you assign? Probably a single digit percentage, probably like 10%, 20%. I would actually advocate for it to be much, much larger probability of this happening. Here's why. In their fourth quarter earnings report, SoFi mentioned government agencies as their case study for notable deals. And this is also the reason why I say it's very important for us to get more details around Galileo clientele, because then we can make connections similar to the one that I'm making in this video. Here's the exact quote from the Q4 earnings press release. Quote, Galileo was recently selected by the U.S. Department of Treasury as a processing partner for Direct Express, a prepaid debit card program that 3.4 million people access for their federal benefits. They go on to mention that their tech platform is a differentiated offering. And you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, Galileo is already partnered with the Department of Treasury. Who's the Treasury Secretary again? Oh yeah, it's the guy in the Fox interview talking about his priorities to fix the IRS systems, highlighting the problems that they're just now for the first time realizing. So you connect those dots. They're already partnered with Galileo, who has been validated as a Department of Treasury partner who's already working for the federal benefits program. It's not a stretch of the imagination to predict that Galileo's leadership and SoFi's leadership are already in contact with Scott Bessent and the Department of Treasury around expanding that partnership outward for deals like the IRS and for more government contracts. And just given how historically the government has been spending money on worthless contracts, I would imagine there's a lot of budget to go around if they can actually validate that this provides a quality opportunity to unlock more efficiency. And so this got me really excited and wanting to talk about it in a video because it can be a massive opportunity for Galileo if they just capture a couple of these contracts that are already being given out for random things that add no value. Like, just think to yourself, even if Galileo wins a $100 million IRS contract, which is a drop in the bucket in the IRS modernization budget of $3.7 billion, that's still a quarter of the full year 2024 revenue that Galileo did on just one contract alone. And then you have to think, well, there are other government agencies that are just as inefficient as the IRS that Galileo can play a part in. Not to mention, there's also the renewals of that initial contract. There's expansions of that initial contract. And as a thought experiment, what comes out as a result is a massive increase in Galileo's revenue for 2025 and 2026 that would not have been there under the previous administration, because the previous administration had no filters for efficiency and for quality, had no filters for accountability, and their only filter was the cheapest possible price, in which case Galileo would not even be bidding on those contracts. So it remains to be seen what will happen with regards to Galileo further entrenching themselves with the Department of Treasury as a partner. Given their initial press release in the Q4 earnings that they're already a partner with the Department of Treasury, just expanding that partnership out further is now the question. And given what we're now seeing with the audits into the IRS systems by Scott Bessent and by Sam Korkus, I'm increasingly hopeful that we're going to see deeper partnerships between SoFi and the US government under this new administration. And that will be a game changer from a revenue perspective of what we can expect Galileo to report this year and also next year. Remains to be seen. I expect management to be talking more about them entrenching further with government partners, but I'm sure we're going to get more details as more of these audits come to light. It's going to be really, really exciting year for SoFi and for Galileo as a whole. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.